Much like that old adage that all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs, all critics are people, but not all people are critics. So inevitably, those two groups are going to disagree from time to time. These games may have taken home stellar scores from certain critics, but weren't taken home by the public. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 out of 10 video games the public rejected. 9. Octopath Traveler 2. Sporting a 10 out of 10 on Steam and a sea of perfect and near-perfect scores, you'd be forgiven for assuming that 2023 JRPG Octopath Traveler 2 was a slam dunk commercially, given the game was an even bigger critical success than its predecessor. Not only that, Octopath Traveler 2 is actually one of the success stories on this list, where critics loved it and the people who went out and bought it loved it. It's just a pity that the number of those second group was not higher, because not that many people bought this one. In its release week, the game shifted only 78,000 units, getting absolutely stomped by Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, which launched on the same day and sold 190,000 copies. Though Team Asano would go on to announce that in just under 4 months on sale, the game sold 1 million units across all platforms, and including both digital and physical sales, Octopath Traveler the First sold the same amount of units in just under a month on shelves, and at that point the game was only available on Switch. Exactly why more fans didn't return to the sequel despite stellar review scores is hard to say. It's possible that the second game launched in a far busier release window, as opposed to the first game, which landed in the middle of July in 2018, only seriously competing with the beefed up version of Sonic Mania and the Xbox release of Nier Automata. Adding to that, there's probably not a lot of audience overlap between Sonic Mania and Octopath Traveler in the first place, and in the case of Nier, there was no pulling diehards out of that game who'd just spent 100, 200 hours in it to drop them into another 100-hour experience, so that one's probably not relevant either. Number 8, Tearaway Unfolded. Remember Tearaway? I didn't. I actually played through the whole of the first game and all of Unfolded on my Vita, because what else were you gonna play on your Vita? But I completely forgot about its existence until I was researching for this list. The 2013 platformer with a bevy of papery graphics and Vita-specific gimmicks that actually worked really well was a hit with critics and players. It won a pile of awards and spawned a sequel, Tearaway Unfolded, which launched just 2 years later. The follow-up scored pretty much the same level of critical acclaim that was levied upon the first game, except this time around, nobody bought it. While loads of us who invested in a Vita and had played enough of Gravity Rush for one lifetime decided to at least give Tearaway a go, because good games for the platform were getting pretty thin and our giant screened handheld console was starting to look like a $350 paperweight, Tearaway Unfolded was a whole other story. The sequel launched in September, which isn't a terrible time to bring out a game, and since the first one was so successful, you'd imagine the same fans would mosey over to the PlayStation 4 to see what this one was all about, but unfortunately, at this particular point in time, on this particular September, gamers were a little preoccupied. Charming though Unfolded was, it absolutely fell apart commercially in the back end of 2015. It tanked so very hard that it didn't even chart on the vast majority of top sales lists in the West or in Japan. Some speculated that Sony sent their first-party kid out to die, but having a look at the release calendar, I'd say that even with the greatest marketing budget known to man, very few gamers would have been electing to tuck into the Tearaway sequel when just 1 week prior, Mad Max and Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain had come out. If that blow wasn't already fatal, Super Mario Maker landing 3 days later, quickly followed by Forza 6 and indie darling Undertale, would have handily scooped up any remaining idle gamers. The writing was absolutely on the wall with this one, or the origami was folded. That doesn't work. Anyway, what happened was we never did get a Tearaway 3. Number 7, Deathloop. Crafted from Arcane Studios, the masterminds behind Dishonored, and whose Austin studio would go on to do Redfall, which, okay, Redfall wasn't very good, but does that mean that the game studio deserved to be shuttered and all those people lose all their jobs? They could have made a good game next. Point being, Arcane seemed to be pretty good solid studio, so everyone thought that Deathloop would be a slam dunk. For many critics, Deathloop did deliver on everything they hoped for. It got a swath of high scores, including a bunch of 10 out of 10s from outlets praising the game for its art style, writing, invasion mechanic, and world building. Deathloop also received loads of accolades, including Game of the Year nominations from pretty much everybody who dispenses such a thing. In contrast, fans were not feeling this one. Though it may have fallen victim to the sort of overhype that skewered games like No Man's Sky and Fallout 76 before it, gamers at large found Deathloop wanting for a bunch of reasons. Plenty of people, including me, reported picking it up only to bounce off it with disappointment over the game's AI, the multiplayer, and the narrative, among other things. That said, there are tons of people who loved Deathloop, and I think in a lot of cases, it probably fell victim to that overhype. We had all of these reviewers, many reviewers coming out with 10 out of 10s, saying this was like the best thing since sliced bread, or whatever the 2024 version of that is. So everyone was going in with these sky-high expectations, and then when it turned out to be just like an 8 out of 10 for them, or 7.5, it felt way lower, and it was super disappointing. In reality, some people may have found this one perfectly enjoyable if they went in expecting a solid 7 out of 10 game, instead of what equated to the second coming of Dishonored. Of course, games are subjective, and much like any of the games that didn't make this list, the games that did will have their diehard fans and their naysayers. But the fact that almost every critic gave Deathloop a stellar score, while the public was deeply divided over its quality, makes the action shooter well and truly list-worthy. Number 6, The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. I use this joke a lot, but I've said divisive enough times now that by law I have to say The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. Now this one has a 93 out of 100 on Metacritic, which obviously is exemplary, but it got memed to by the internet for being, well, a bit. Whether it is or not will vary from person to person. In fact, if we take away the user score averages on Google and Metacritic, they're an overwhelmingly positive 96% thumbs up and 8.1 respectively, suggesting the vast majority of people really liked it. But boy would you not know it from the infamous derision this game earned as, for a time, the internet's most hated Zelda game. Slammed for its incessant hand-holding via the means of FI, art style, control scheme, which at certain points made entire segments agonizing, needless padding, and antagonist Girahim, who is either a cult favorite, tongue-wagging camp icon giving gay in all the right ways, or borderline offensive, your call. Reception for Skyward Sword was probably also impacted negatively given it came out just 1 week after Skyrim, which didn't have the same padding or control issues. Also, not even making the cut as the best Sky game that came out that week is just such a tough break. Much like Deathloop, this one might have been a bit of a victim of its own hype and success, since if it wasn't for all the critics coming out saying this one was a slam dunk 10 out of 10, maybe it wouldn't have been so heavily criticized once the general public got their hands on it. Or maybe it's crap. I don't know. Your mileage may vary. You tell me. There's a good chance that public opinion on this one changed dramatically when the HD version landed in 2021. Even though that's an entire decade off the original hit shelves, the Switch version benefited enormously from dropping the inconsistent Wiimote and nunchuck controls, alongside fine-tuning the performance and letting players decide on their control scheme of choice, which is always a good thing. Number 5, Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose isn't on this list because the internet hated it, or even because critics hated it. It was sort of a victim of its own controversy, as unfortunately, it just sort of came out at a time where it wasn't acceptable for it to be doing the kinds of things in the realm of video games that it was doing, particularly in the aspects of its narrative themes. Punchline's 2006 survival horror would eventually rise to cult classic status, but outside of those circles, it remains largely unknown. Back when moral panic and video games went hand in hand way more often than they do now, Rule of Rose became page 6 level gossip for supposedly featuring extreme sexual themes, violence, and pretty much every item in the book that would lead someone who'd never played a video game to find some pearls to clutch. By and large, many of these claims weren't even accurate, and the same ones that were again, a victim of their own time. Now, they wouldn't be outlandish or unheard of in the medium at all. Getting to the reality of the title and not its exaggerated perception, Rule of Rose has fairly rudimentary gameplay mechanics, but its story is well worth the price of admission. Protagonist Jennifer has a little dog that gets hurt, which is honestly one of the worst parts, and the narrative does feature kidnapping, torture, suicide, violence involving children, and loads of inarguably dark elements. All that said, the general public, including critics, really turned on this one, calling it exploitative and unpleasant, and as a result, sales were skewered before it even hit the market. market. Those who did vibe with it, though, praised its representation of deep psychological horror and its compelling narrative that successfully seesawed between the disturbing and emotional. It's certainly an uncomfortable play, but only in the way in which brutal horror movies are an uncomfortable watch. Go in expecting a fun time, and it's no wonder people walked away finding it disturbing and distasteful, but if you go in expecting a rich horror experience with dark themes that are explored in a really interesting way, then it absolutely does that to a T. Number 4, Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2, or as it's known to some people, the bad Souls game, or the disappointing Souls game if we're going to be a little less extreme about it, actually has stellar review scores, better than loads of other FromSoft games. In fact, you'll have to check out Metacritic if you don't believe me, but it actually has a quantifiable rating that is better than Dark Souls, Dark Souls 3, and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. It sparked controversy among those who weren't a fan of the Souls threequel for pacing issues, random spikes in difficulty coupled with breezy encounters, irritating ambushes, and an overload of bosses, while some also took issue with the game's comparatively shallow narrative and more linear map design. This is a tricky one because while the majority of fans statistically seem to come away feeling favorable about the game, the group who were more critical was certainly a lot more vocal. In this case, one man's pleasingly complex systems, improved spell integration, and exceptional bosses were another's gripes over the combat and health mechanics. There's a little suspicion over whether professional critics might have been influenced by the groundswell of public belief that Souls games by this point could do no wrong. Similar to Dragon Age 2, there was a bit of skepticism over Dark Souls 2 that perhaps these reviewers have been influenced by the idea that at this point, these series were going to just become these 10 out of 10 incredible things that just kept churning out A+ games, and the developers could do no wrong, and just that being the zeitgeist of the moment, even if it wasn't intentionally influencing them, might have inevitably done that. After that fact, enough people took to Reddit to express their frustrations with Dragon Age 2 and of course Dark Souls 2, which cemented both in the realm of infamously divisive. Number 3, Planescape Torment. Following on from games that people love to hate or hate to love, Planescape Torment is almost universally agreed upon to be one of the greatest games ever made. And in this case, both critics and fans seem to agree. It's just unfortunate that nobody bought it. Despite iterating on digital RPG systems in a fascinating way and enabling player freedom of interaction in a way not many games of this scope and size had done so at the time, Planescape Torment presented as perhaps a little too niche for its own good. While its grand and delightfully complex narrative and witty dialogue is a joy to immerse yourself in, it was a trickier thing to sell gamers. With a 91 out of 100 on Metacritic and a final product that lived up to its 10 out of 10s, the game should have been too critically acclaimed to fail, even without a successful marketing campaign, but it only sold 73,000 copies in its first 4 months on shelves. The sales numbers definitely improved somewhat, and of course now it's hit that cult status, but Planescape definitely sunk under the weight of RPGs that came out right around the same time, like Ultima 9, that everybody just knew exactly what they were in for. Number 2, Overwatch 2. I've saved these top 2 spots for games that actually a bunch of critics came out and were like, oh my gosh, they've done it again. Well done. This is a slam dunk. And then players finally got their hands on it and said, oh my gosh, absolutely not, in droves. And it wasn't because of a marketing campaign or they were too niche or they were too controversial. They were just a letdown. So let's talk about these. I'll parrot my subjective statement again just to cover the inevitability that you or someone you know actually likes or loves one or both of these games, but chances are you probably don't. Knowing how much everybody absolutely dunked on Overwatch 2, you might have forgotten that Blizzard's team shooter cleaned up in the impressive review score department at launch. Most of the major outlets pinned it with 8s, if not 9s, but players were not having it. Despite gathering more than double the players of its predecessor in its launch month, that really just meant that even more players were primed for frustration. That said, it's not quite accurate like I've done with the other games on this list to judge it from its user reviews, since there was not one reason but 3 pretty prime reasons that this one was a target for review bombing. The The first was Activision Blizzard's harassment allegations, the second being Blizzard ditching their partnership with Chinese company NetEase that meant players in the region couldn't use local servers, and finally the game itself dropped its intended PvE content and swapped out loot boxes for a battle pass. There were also complaints about the game's matchmaking and everything in the game being nickel and dimed to oblivion. It was always going to be really hard to live up to the first game since that was so beloved, but boy did they miss the mark by just they couldn't even see the mark from where they landed. Number 1, Starfield. If you didn't see it coming before, you'd probably be none too surprised to see this one in the top slot. Starfield certainly has its fans, but much like Overwatch 2, this was expected to nail it since it came from a studio who proved they had the capacity to produce a truly masterful video game. Unfortunately, Starfield was not a masterful video game. In fact, most people found it to be pretty average. But again, you wouldn't know it from the review scores. If you haven't checked this one out already, and I don't think you would believe me if you didn't look for yourself, it got 10 out of 10s from a ton of different outlets. In fact, even its Metacritic is an 85 out of 100. So what happened? While the game is, by most reports, in better shape now than it was at launch almost a year ago, there's still a massive gulf between the critical reviews praising the game world, graphics, joy of exploration, and score, as opposed to the reception from the public. Some players took to online forums to say they found the experience to be mediocre but not fantastic, while others criticized the narrative for being largely soulless, in addition to the game's one-note characters, disappointing systems and writing, and reliance on procedural generation that stripped the game of that rich Bethesda goodness. Maybe you like this one more than other people, or maybe you hated it more, but that sheer disparity between the critical reception and the reception of the public at large definitely makes this one of the most divisive video games in recent memory. If you can think of any other ones that absolutely should be on this list, you know where to put them.